Kneel to my wife or leave. The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shards of glass. They came from my son, Mark, the boy I had raised on my own, the man I had given everything to. His face was a mask of strained resolve, his eyes flicking nervously towards the woman standing beside him, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Clara, my daughter-in-law, the architect of this grotesque theater. She was the one who had fed him the poison, drop by insidious drop, until he was so thoroughly infected that he could stand before his own father and issue such an ultimatum. Kneel. The word itself was an obscenity. It implied submission, defeat, an admission of wrongdoing where none existed. My crime? I had dared to question her decision to purchase a $50,000 watch using the company credit card, the company I had built from dust and sacrifice. I had suggested, gently, that perhaps such an expense was unwise when we were trying to expand the business. For that, I was to kneel. I looked from my son's wavering gaze to Clara's cold, expectant one. I saw the future they had planned for me, a neutered, silent old man, a relic to be tolerated in a corner of the grand house I had paid for, his opinions discarded, his presence a mere footnote in their glittering life. They saw a dependent, a burden. They saw weakness. They had no idea who I really was. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a slow, cold curving of the lips that didn't reach my eyes. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the key to a locked cage. I see, I said, my voice calm, betraying none of the glacial fury solidifying around my heart. Then I'll take the second option. I turned without another word, walked to the hall closet where my overnight bag was always kept for business trips, and slung it over my shoulder. Mark's face crumpled in confusion. Dad, wait. That's it. You're just leaving. He had expected me to beg, to argue, to break down. He had expected the weak, old man of their imagination. Clara's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in her reptilian eyes. This wasn't part of her script. I paused at the door, my hand on the polished brass knob that I myself had installed 20 years ago. I looked back at them, standing there in the grand foyer of my house, looking like two spoiled children who had just broken their favorite toy. You gave me a choice, Mark, I said, my voice even. Kneel or leave. I don't kneel. And with that, I walked out into the cool evening air, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, sealing them in their gilded cage. They thought they had won. They thought they had exiled me. The fools. They hadn't exiled me. They had just unleashed me. The drive to the hotel was a blur of streetlights and memories. Every turn of the wheel brought a fresh wave of the past. I remembered bringing Mark home from the hospital, a tiny, screaming bundle wrapped in blue. His mother, my beloved Sarah, had been so weak, but her eyes had shone with a light so brilliant it could have outshone the sun. We had lost her just 3 years later, a sickness that came on fast and cruel, leaving me with a shattered heart and a small boy who still asked when Mommy was coming home. My life from that moment on had a singular purpose. Mark. I worked 2 jobs, then 3. I started a small consulting firm from the kitchen table of our tiny apartment, working through the night after putting Mark to bed, my only fuel-cheap coffee and a burning desire to give him the world his mother would have wanted for him. I never remarried. There was no room in my heart for anyone but Sarah, and no time in my life for anyone but Mark. I was his father, mother, cook, chauffeur, and tutor. I never missed a school play or a baseball game. I taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie, how to treat people with respect, or so I thought. The business grew. My kitchen table venture, Sterling Solutions, became a respected name in the industry. We moved from the tiny apartment to a modest house, and then, when I finally landed the big contracts, to the sprawling 6-bedroom estate that Mark and Clara now consider their own. I did it all for him. When he graduated from college with a business degree, I brought him into the company. I wanted him to learn the ropes, to understand the value of hard work. I made him start in the mailroom, just as I had started in my first job. He complained, of course. He felt it was beneath him, but I held firm, wanting to instill in him a sense of humility. Eventually, he worked his way up. I mentored him. I taught him everything I knew about the business, about integrity, about legacy. I made him vice president, grooming him to take over one day. My plan was always to retire, to hand him the reins, to know that the empire I built for him was in safe hands. Then came Clara. She was beautiful, charming, and ambitious. Mark was utterly smitten, and in my desire to see him happy, I ignored the warning signs. I ignored the way her eyes would scan a room, not taking in the people, but cataloging the value of the art on the walls, the brand of the furniture. I ignored her casual, dismissive comments about my old-fashioned ways, my frugal habits. "Oh, Arthur, nobody wears that brand anymore," she'd say with a tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You should let me take you shopping." I saw the way she encouraged Mark's worst impulses, his laziness, his sense of entitlement. Suddenly, the mailroom story was no longer a lesson in humility, but a tale of my cruelty. "Your father was so mean to you," she'd coo, stroking his arm at the dinner table. "Making his own son work like that." She slowly, systematically, began to paint me as an out-of-touch relic, a doddering old fool whose time had passed. She was positioning herself as the modern, savvy mind the company needed, with Mark as her handsome figurehead. The final piece of my grand plan for Mark was to give him a sense of ownership, of ultimate responsibility. On his 30th birthday, 5 years ago, I signed over the majority of the company's shares to him. I made him CEO. I transferred the deed of the house into a trust with him as the primary beneficiary. On paper, it was all his. I stepped back into a consultant role, drawing a modest salary, content to watch my son lead the company I had bled for. It was the ultimate act of trust, and it was my greatest mistake. What Mark didn't know, what I had never told him, was that my lawyer, a shrewd and loyal man named David, had insisted on a failsafe. The documents I signed were complex. While Mark was the CEO and majority shareholder, I retained what was called a golden share, a single, special class of stock that held ultimate veto power and the unilateral right to reclaim all other shares under specific conditions. Conditions such as gross mismanagement or actions that brought the company into disrepute. The house, too, was in a revocable trust. I could, with a single signature, revoke his status as beneficiary and reclaim the title entirely. I had these protections put in place not because I didn't trust my son, but because I feared the world's influence on him. I just never imagined the most dangerous influence would be living under his own roof. Clara's spending started small. A new designer wardrobe, a luxury car. Then came the extravagant vacations, the redecorating of the house with gaudy, overpriced furniture. I tried to speak to Mark about it, to caution him. "Son, we need to reinvest in the company. We have to watch our expenditures." He would just wave a dismissive hand. "Don't worry, Dad. Clara knows what she's doing. It's about image. We have to look successful to be successful." It was her voice coming out his mouth. My son, my thoughtful, once-grounded son, was gone, replaced by this parrot. My presence in the house became an inconvenience. I was the ghost at their feast, a constant, nagging reminder of a past they wanted to erase. My simple meals were an embarrassment when they had chef-prepared dinners. My old armchair in the living room was an eyesore. I was moved into the smallest guest room at the back of the house. My opinion on any matter, business or personal, no longer sought or welcomed. I became a witness to my own erasure. The incident with the watch was the final straw. I was reviewing the quarterly financials and saw the $50,000 charge from a high-end jeweler. It was on the corporate account. While I confronted Mark, he was defensive. "It's a business expense, Dad. It's a networking tool." Then Clara glided in, wearing the watch, its diamonds flashing like cruel little stars. "Arthur, you simply don't understand modern business," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This watch opens doors." That's when I told them it was reckless, that it was tantamount to theft from the company we all depended on. Clara's face hardened into a mask of fury. She accused me of trying to control her, of being a jealous old man who couldn't stand to see his son's wife have nice things. She stormed out, and Mark, after a moment of hesitation, followed her. That night, I overheard them arguing. Or rather, I heard her issuing commands. He's undermining me, Mark. He's trying to turn you against me. You have to choose. It's him or me. If you want me to stay, you have to put him in his place. Make him understand who is in charge now. I heard my son's weak protests, his pathetic attempts to reason with her, all of them steamrolled by her relentless pressure. The next morning, they confronted me in the foyer, and my son, the boy I loved more than life itself, told me to kneel. Checking into the penthouse suite of the city's finest hotel, I felt a profound and terrible calm settle over me. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my patience for senility, my generosity for dependence. They were about to receive a very abrupt education. I took out my phone and made my first call. "David," I said when my lawyer answered. "It's Arthur Sterling. It's time. Execute the contingency protocol, all of it." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then David's voice, grim but steady. "Arthur, are you absolutely sure? There's no going back from this. I am more sure of this than I have been of anything in a very long time," I replied, looking out the panoramic window at the city lights twinkling below, a city I had helped build. They made their choice. Now I'm making mine. The second call was to the bank manager who handled the corporate accounts. I identified myself, provided the security codes that only I knew, and instructed him to freeze every credit card and line of credit associated with Sterling Solutions, effective immediately. I specifically named the cards held by Mark Sterling and Clara Sterling. The manager was flustered, but the authority in my voice, backed by the legal codes, was undeniable. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Right away, sir." Their financial lifeblood was now cut off. They just didn't know it yet. My third call was to the head of security at the company headquarters. "Jim, it's Arthur. I need you to change the access codes to the executive floor in Mark's office tonight. He is no longer an employee of this company. Deny him access if he shows up tomorrow. An official email from the board will follow." Jim, who had been with me for 30 years, simply said, "You got it, boss. It's good to hear your voice." I spent the next day in a whirlwind of activity. I met with David to sign the documents. The first was the revocation of the trust on the house. The property was now solely and indisputably back in my name. The second was the activation of my golden share. With a stroke of a pen, all of Mark's shares were recalled and reverted to me. I was once again the 100% owner of Sterling Solutions. David had already prepared the paperwork. He had seen this coming long before I had been willing to admit it to myself. We drafted a termination letter for Mark, citing gross misuse of company funds and a breach of fiduciary duty. We also drafted an eviction notice for the house, giving them 72 hours to vacate the premises. It was brutal, it was clinical, and it was absolutely necessary. My heart ached for the son I was losing, but the man he had become was a stranger to me, a puppet whose strings were pulled by a greedy, manipulative woman. To save the company, to save my own self-respect, I had to cut those strings. I knew it wouldn't take long. Their lifestyle was a ravenous beast that required constant feeding. The first sign of trouble would be a declined credit card. I imagined Clara at some expensive boutique, her face contorting from smugness to confusion, then to rage, as the cashier apologetically informed her that her card was not working. I pictured her trying another, and another, the humiliation mounting with each rejection. The first call came 2 days after I left. It was Mark. His voice was tight with anxiety. "Dad, what's going on? None of our cards are working, and I can't get into my office. Jim at security said he was acting on your orders. What is this? Some kind of joke?" The use of the word "our cards" was not lost on me. "It's no joke, Mark," I said calmly. "I think we need to talk. Why don't you and Clara come to the house this evening? Say 7 o'clock. I'll meet you there." "Meet us there? Dad, we live there. What are you talking about?" The panic was rising in his voice. 7 o'clock, Mark," I repeated and hung up the phone. I arrived at the house at 6:30. I let myself in with my old key, the one they never knew I kept. The house felt alien. Clara's taste was everywhere. Cold, modern furniture, abstract art that was meaningless, inexpensive, gold-plated fixtures that screamed new money. My old armchair was gone. replaced by a white leather monstrosity that looked deeply uncomfortable. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own home, every object a testament to their greed and my blindness. On the gleaming marble of the front hall table, I saw an envelope. It was from a process server. I picked it up. It was the eviction notice. They had been served, right on schedule. At 7 o'clock sharp, the doorbell chimed. I opened the door to find them standing on the porch, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. Clara pushed past me without a word, her eyes scanning the foyer as if looking for something out of place. Mark followed, looking lost. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" "We got this," he said, waving the eviction notice in his hand. "This is insane. You can't evict us from our own home." I closed the door and turned to face them. I gestured for them to sit on the uncomfortable white leather sofa. They remained standing, defiant. "It's not your home, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "It never was. It has always been, and is now, legally my home." Clara let out a short, barking laugh. "That's absurd. The deed is in Mark's name. We have the papers. You have papers for a revocable trust, of which Mark was the beneficiary." I corrected her gently. "A trust which I revoked 2 days ago. The house is mine. The paperwork has already been filed with the county." The color drained from Clara's face. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with disbelief and fury. "What is he talking about, Mark?" Mark just shook his head, utterly bewildered. "Dad, why would you do this?" "Over a stupid argument." "A stupid argument?" I echoed, my own anger, long suppressed, finally beginning to surface. "You told me to kneel, Mark. You stood by while your wife systematically bled my company dry, a company I built with my own 2 hands while I was raising you alone. You called my life's work a networking tool for her to buy jewelry. This isn't about an argument. This is about a fundamental lack of respect, gratitude, and character." I walked over to the briefcase I'd set by the door and opened it. I took out a thick file. "Let's talk about the company," I said, my voice turning to ice. "Your company, you mean?" Clara sneered, regaining a sliver of her bravado. "Mark is the CEO. He owns it." I smiled that cold smile again. "An interesting assumption. It's true I made him CEO. It's true I signed over the majority of the shares to him. But a good businessman always has a contingency plan." I pulled out the first document and laid it on the polished coffee table. "This, Clara, is the Articles of Incorporation for Sterling Solutions. And this," I said, pointing to a specific clause, "details the existence of a single golden share. A share I retained. A share that grants the holder ultimate, unassailable control of the company. It gives me the power to veto any board decision and, under circumstances of gross financial misconduct, to recall all other issued shares." I let that sink in. Mark's face went completely pale. He looked like he was going to be sick. Clara snatched the paper, her eyes scanning it frantically. She might be greedy, but she wasn't stupid. She understood what it meant. "And this," I continued, placing a second document on top of the first, "is the official, legally executed activation of that clause. As of 10 a.m. yesterday, all shares issued to Mark Sterling were recalled. I am, once again, the sole owner of Sterling Solutions." Clara looked up from the paper, her face a mask of pure hatred. "You can't do this." "I can," I said simply. "And I have. Which brings me to this." I placed Mark's termination letter on the pile. "Your employment at the company has been terminated, Mark. Effective immediately. For cause. I believe misuse of company funds is the official term. That $50,000 watch was quite the purchase. I'm sure the IRS will be interested in it during their audit." Mark finally collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "Dad, I didn't know, no," I said, my voice softening for a moment with a flicker of pity for the broken man who was my son. "You didn't know. You didn't bother to know. You didn't read the documents I asked you to read. You didn't ask the important questions. You just took. You and her, you just took and assumed the fountain would never run dry. You assumed I was a foolish old man you could push aside." My gaze shifted to Clara, who was now trembling, not with fear, but with incandescent rage. "You," she hissed, pointing a finger at me. "You did this to ruin me." "No, I said, shaking my head. You did this to yourself. I gave you a chance. I welcomed you into my family, into my home, into my business. I gave you everything on a silver platter, and you treated it all with contempt. You saw my son not as a partner, but as a tool. You saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. You thought you could discard me, but you cannot discard the foundation of the house you live in, Clara. Sooner or later, the whole thing comes crashing down. I gestured to the eviction notice on the table. You have 72 hours to vacate my property. That time is nearly up. I suggest you start packing. You'll find your credit cards are no longer of any use, and your bank accounts, which were tied to the company, have been frozen pending a full financial audit. Everything you own, every piece of clothing, every piece of jewelry you bought with my company's money will be considered a company asset and will be seized. The fight went out of her then. The rage crumbled, replaced by a stark, primal panic. Her world, built on a foundation of my money and my son's weakness, had just been demolished in the span of 10 minutes. She looked around the opulent room, at the expensive art, the designer furniture, as if seeing it all for the first time as what it was, temporary, illusory. Mark was sobbing now, quiet, pathetic sounds. Dad, please, he whispered. I am sorry. I was stupid. She got in my head. Please don't do this. For a moment, my heart wavered. This was my son, my boy. But then I looked at his face and saw not just regret for his actions, but terror at his consequences. His apology was born of desperation, not genuine remorse. He was sorry he got caught. The time for apologies was 2 days ago, Mark, I said, my voice heavy with a sorrow that was deeper than any anger. When you stood in this very spot and told your father to kneel before this woman. You made your choice. You chose her and the life she offered you. Now you get to live with that choice. Both of you. I walked to the door and opened it. Your 72 hours are almost up. A moving crew will be here tomorrow morning at 9 to remove my belongings. Anything left behind will be considered abandoned. I suggest you call a taxi. You won't be able to afford the payment on that luxury car in the driveway for much longer. Clara shot me one last look of pure venom before grabbing a stunned Mark by the arm and pulling him towards the door. They stumbled out into the night, no longer the lord and lady of the manor, but two castaways, shipwrecked by their own greed. I watched them go, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel old or weak or invisible. I felt like Arthur Sterling again, the man who built an empire from nothing, the man who had just taken it all back. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of their financial recklessness came to light. Clara had been funneling company money into personal accounts, covering her tracks with falsified expense reports that Mark, in his blissful ignorance, had signed off on. My lawyers and accountants descended on the books like vultures on a carcass, uncovering a pattern of fraud and embezzlement that was breathtaking in its audacity. The audit revealed they had burned through nearly $2 million in just 3 years on personal luxuries, all disguised as business expenses. Legal proceedings were initiated not just by me, but by the state. Clara was facing serious charges. Mark, as the signing officer, was also implicated, though my lawyers argued successfully that he was a victim of manipulation, not an active conspirator. He escaped criminal charges, but his reputation was in ruins. He was a pariah in the business community. They lost everything. The house, the cars, the clothes, the jewelry. It was all repossessed. Clara's family, who had lauded her for marrying into such wealth, wanted nothing to do with her once the money was gone. She and Mark moved into a small, run-down apartment on the other side of town. The same kind of apartment I had started in all those years ago. The irony was not lost on me. Mark tried to contact me several times. He left long, rambling voicemails, filled with tears and apologies and desperate pleas for a second chance. He blamed Clara for everything, painting himself as her unwitting pawn. I never answered. I never called back. My heart ached for the son he used to be, but I knew that taking him back now would teach him nothing. Some lessons have to be learned in the crucible of loss. He needed to find his own way back to the man he was supposed to be, without my help, without my money. I took back the reins of Sterling Solutions. It was a mess. Their mismanagement had left the company bloated and inefficient. I spent months cleaning house, trimming the fat, and getting us back on solid footing. I worked harder than I had in 20 years, but it felt good. It felt right. I was back where I belonged, in control of my own destiny, protecting the legacy I had built. One evening, about 6 months after I had kicked him out, there was a knock on my door. It was Mark. He looked thin and tired. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans and a simple jacket. He wasn't crying or begging. He just stood there on the porch, his eyes filled with a quiet, profound shame. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Dad," he said, his voice hoarse. I wanted to tell you that you were right. About everything. I was weak, and I was a fool. I let her blind me. I broke your trust, and I broke your heart. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it." He told me he and Clara had separated. He was working a simple job at a logistics warehouse, paying his own bills for the first time in his life. He was starting over, from the mailroom, so to speak. I didn't invite him in. Not yet. But I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time since that horrible day, I saw a flicker of the boy I had raised. The journey back for him would be long and hard, and he had to walk it alone. But for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope that he might one day find his way home. I gave him a simple nod. "That's a start, son," I said, and closed the door. Vengeance is a bitter medicine, but sometimes it's the only cure. They forced me to burn down the life I had built for my son, but in the ashes, perhaps he could finally learn to build one for himself.